There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hi there, just a heads up that this conversation contains a discussion of domestic violence and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. In a little farmhouse on the New South Wales south coast, in a tiny town called Pericoe, the ghosts of 3 little children and the man who was supposed to protect them still linger. 9-year-old Jack, 7-year-old Maddie, and 18-month-old Bon, the youngest named for the lead singer of iconic Aussie band AC/DC, were a constant presence in and around their little home in the early 2000s. The squeaking bounce of the trampoline and their excited chatter, the backing track of the neighbourhood. But by the end of June 2008, there were no more enthusiastic shouts, no more squeaking trampoline or slamming front screens as little feet ran in and out. On a Sunday evening, their father would commit an unforgivable act that would extinguish those little sounds forever. Their mum, Karen Bell, would often watch over her children as they played, but on more occasions than not, she would be doing so while nursing bruises and other injuries, pains inflicted by her violent and abusive husband. Karen was just 17 when she met Gary. He was a lot older. At 29, he'd already been married and divorced, but he seemed like a charming guy. He told Karen that his ex was to blame for their marriage breakdown and that it was because of her that he wasn't allowed to see his kids. But it would later come out that Gary wasn't the doting father who was sadly estranged from his first family. He'd abandoned his first wife, who was left to raise their 4 sons alone. Almost immediately after Gary and Karen's relationship started, Gary did what so many men with violent and controlling tendencies do. He isolated her, moving her away from her friends and family to the little house in Pericoe, making it difficult for her to maintain relationships. If she complained, Gary would answer with his fists, his boots, or whatever he could pick up at the time, hurling objects at her that would leave her with injuries so traumatic they'd leave a map of bruises and scars over her body. She would try to leave. She would flee to a neighbour or hitchhike back to her parents' place in Bega. But Gary always had the upper hand, because while Karen herself was allowed to flee the violence, he wouldn't let her take the children. Karen was stuck, but she knew that it was getting worse. She knew that if she didn't get away from him, she would die. So one night, she fled to the neighbours and hoped that her children would be okay. But they weren't okay. Gary Bell left audio recordings and letters for his wife, explaining to her how his children couldn't live without him and he couldn't live without them. So if she was leaving, then this is what he had to do. And he did. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. And this month, we've been examining Australian stories of retaliatory filicide, an act where a parent takes the life of their own children, a selfish move designed to inflict the most pain and suffering they can on a partner who won't behave as they want them to. Sadly, Karen Bell and her children are victims of this type of crime. Karen's 15-year-long relationship with Bell was filled with emotional and physical abuse. Multiple AVOs were taken out against him to protect Karen, and he faced charges more than once for assaulting her. But in the early hours of Sunday, the 22nd of June 2009, Gary Bell was released on bail after yet another attack on his wife, with another court case and a likely jail sentence hanging over him. As he made his way home, Karen made an impossible decision. She knew she needed to leave him or risk another attack that could end up being her last. But Gary's trump card was always the kids, he would never let her take them. So she did what she had to survive. She packed her bags and left their Pericoe farmhouse, leaving her 3 children with the father they loved so dearly, a man who seemed to love them in return, and despite years of abuse towards Karen, had never hurt a single hair on their children's heads. She did what she thought was right. She made the choices she thought would save her and her children. But when violent men lose control, they sometimes get it back by taking away the one thing they know will cause the most destruction. Journalist and award-winning author Megan Norris joins us again today to detail this case, which is featured in her book, Look What You Made Me Do, Fathers Who Kill. She joins us now. So Megan, when you read the story of Karen Bell and her little children, it's hard not to draw a lot of comparisons between her experience and Michelle Steck's experience, who we spoke about a few weeks ago. She endured so much at the hands of her abusive partner and then husband. But when did they meet, and what were the circumstances under which they first came to be together, and what attracted her to him?
Well, when they met, she was much younger. She was a teenager. Karen was 17 when she met Gary, whose name then was Gary Mills. He called himself Gary Mills. That was his mother's maiden name, not his real name. He'd been married and separated. He was the father of 4 children. So he was young at 29 to be the father of 4 children. And he'd left that relationship, and that was a very acrimonious breakup. Karen thought he was beautiful. He was charming. He was good looking. He was very small for his age. And a lot of the locals after all call him as this motor mouth, small man, big mouth, big ego. You know, that's how they recalled it. But she found him charismatic. He certainly was charismatic to the community that knew him. He was a good AFL player. He was very sporty. And he was a sort of affable Aussie bloke, but with a nasty streak when he'd been drinking. That was well known. Karen never saw that side of him to begin with. She just saw the charming veneer, and that's the man she fell in love with.
Now, you said she first met him as Gary Mills, but he then takes her surname at some stage. Was there any explanation for that?
No, there wasn't. All the friends that knew him thought it was most bizarre, as did Karen's family. But by then Karen was under his spell, so she thought nothing of it. He had been born Gary Mark Poxon to English migrant parents to Australia, one of 4 boys, and his name was Poxon. And after the separation from his first wife, he popped up in Bega as Gary Mills. That's his mother's maiden name. When Karen met him, he was Gary Mills. Within a very short time of meeting her, he became Karen Bell. He suggested that if there were going to be an item, he wanted her name. He didn't really give an explanation for why that was. It was almost like he was reinventing himself in a new town with a new relationship, reinventing himself with a new persona. And he said it was a fresh start and he was starting again and he was going to do it by taking her name. Basically, the argument was, what the heck? Women take their husbands' names all the time. Why shouldn't I take yours? I think she was a bit flattered by it because it was unusual. And that would have been in the early 90s when they met, so after his marriage breakdown. I've got a more cynical take on that, as did some of the people who knew him, that he said he was trying to distance himself from this dreadful former wife and this dreadful relationship, claimed that his wife was vicious, she was a liar, she was a con woman, she ripped him off and wouldn't let him see his 4 children, and she was giving him heaps. He referred to her in a very sort of unfavourable way as the bitch of Bega. It was very bitter. But he said awful things. He said that she'd lied to the police and said that he threatened to kill her, that he was violent to her, all of which later became true in Karen's relationship. So you wonder whether he'd fled another very violent, dysfunctional relationship to repeat the pattern, because there is a theme there. But I think it was because he was avoiding maintenance, because basically it transpired that he'd abandoned his former wife with 4 small children and left her to it. So I think there might have been another motive to having a different identity where child welfare couldn't track you down and make you pay maintenance.
Now, you mentioned there that this is all happening around the town of Bega, but eventually Gary and Karen move out to Pericoe on the south coast, a very, very small little town. Do we know what brought them out there?
Yes, he wanted a new start, somewhere peaceful and calm. I think there was an ulterior motive for that. I found that quite fascinating, that Karen, of all of the women whose cases I did and the mothers I spoke to, was isolated geographically, because where they went to live was in the Pericoe Valley. Now, the Pericoe Valley is certainly a place where you could lose yourself, but you could also lose yourself if you were a man avoiding financial obligations to a family of 4. So he sort of had sporadic work here and there as a welder, and decided they'd have this lovely lifestyle, live a simple, quiet, calm life in the bush. Well, it really was, because this place, the Pericoe Valley, is very remote, densely forested. It's on the edge of or in the midst of the Toowoomba forest. It's about 90 kilometres inland from Eden, and it's basically in the middle of nowhere. Now, that place in the 60s appealed to a sort of hippie generation that liked the idea of finding themselves in the bush and growing their own food and being self-sufficient. It was a sort of hippie haven for quite a few years, until they sunk into a lifestyle of growing and taking drugs and booze and parties, and they were itinerant, and it sort of all fizzled out. The locals called it Deliverance Valley, but it also became known as the Valley of Failure, because it was a place where big dreams went pear-shaped, basically, as did Gary Bell's. So they go to live in this farmhouse, and it's on 400 acres of bush in the middle of nowhere. So he's immediately geographically isolated this pretty young teenage girl, who very quickly falls pregnant and has 2 children in quick succession, followed by a third later on. But she's isolated from her family. She gives up her job in the beauty salon. Then that's not enough for him. He then decides he's going to brew his own home brew. There were rumours that he was brewing moonshine, who knows? But he was brewing his own home brew, and he had a severe drinking problem, and growing his own marijuana, which he was then using, and he had a severe marijuana addiction too. So she's living on her own in the middle of nowhere, no phone reception, no mobile phone reception, where he was constantly ripping the landline out of the wall in these drug-fueled frenzies. And she had nowhere to escape to. So he's got her completely under his control, no job, no independence, no freedom. He then decides he wants her to homeschool the children. So he's adding yet more chores onto her already hard-working day. So she's doing everything from chopping wood for the generator. She's got to keep the fire going. She's got to keep the kids entertained and educate them. And those kids were very happy at the little local bush school. But he said no, he wanted them to be withdrawn from school because of the cost. It wasn't really cost. It was more control and more work for Karen. So she was exhausted. She was working all the time, being a full-time mum, an educator, a slave, and a punch bag in between times. So it was a really awful life. And I found it interesting that the property was called Hell's Bells, which obviously Gary thought was quite funny, but Hell's Bells, and it was hell on earth, it was Hell's Bells. Hell let loose all the time behind the gates there. And who could she go to?
Well, you mentioned that she had nowhere to run to, but she would still try in those times. He would often lock her out of the house, kick her out of the car in the middle of nowhere. So she would often find herself trying to get to neighbours' properties or back to her parents' house in Bega. Too many times to count, I think, in the times where he got very badly violent with her.
Yes, a pattern sort of emerged during the relationship where she said the first time he ever attacked her, she remembers it distinctly to this day, that he threw a big ornamental plant at her and fractured her finger. He threw it so hard, she wasn't expecting it, and she put her hands out to defend her face, and it broke her finger. And there were apologies. That was the first violent thing he'd done. There'd been a lot of arguments growing. He was jealous, possessive and controlling. He wanted everything his way, and she had to do what she was told or he'd get nasty. Most of what she did was trying to placate him and keep him calm, which wasn't working. And after that incident with the finger, things started to escalate. They certainly escalated during the first two pregnancies. And she sort of developed a way of protecting herself was to take the children and leave. And a lot of the times then he wouldn't let her take the children. He didn't want her to take the children, but his beatings had become much more violent. They'd increased in frequency during the pregnancies. When she had the second baby, Maddie, he couldn't stand the little girl screaming, and she'd got colic and she'd got reflux. So she was crying quite a bit through pain, and he wanted the baby adopting out. He didn't want that baby. He wanted her to get rid of the baby. He wanted it gone. It was quite bizarre. And all Karen wanted was a family. It's all she wanted. And he said he loved the kids, and she says he certainly showed the kids a great deal of love and affection, and they appeared to love him. Once they got a bit older, he certainly was very engaged with them, and Maddie absolutely adored him.
But he ended up getting a medical diagnosis that seemed to explain some of his erratic behaviour. What did they find?
In 2000, he was diagnosed with front temporal lobe epilepsy. And Karen was actually really relieved to know that. She said, A, it explained his violent mood swings, but B, it wasn't her fault, because he always told her that every beating he gave her, it was her fault. It was her own fault for doing this to make him so angry. If you hadn't made me that angry, I wouldn't have done it. So everything was her fault. And so this diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy explained the seizures too. He was having seizures, and he was prescribed medication, which he refused to take. But in the third pregnancy, he started to take that medication. And she said it was amazing. He was calmer. He was less abusive. There were less beatings. It was much better until he stopped again. And then it was all to do with the marijuana and the booze.
Despite Gary taking Karen's last name very quickly after they began dating in 1993, it wasn't until 2004 that the pair got married after the birth of their second child, Maddie. In your book, you say that by this stage, he'd already been very violent with her and she'd suffered many, many beatings. Why did she say yes to marrying him?
Well, she said by then there was no way she was ever going to leave the children, and there was no way he was going to let her leave with them. He always said that. He would hunt her down and kill her. So, no one's taking my kids. And his thing was, my kids can't live without me. So he would use that to manipulate her. My kids love me. They can't live without me. She felt trapped. So she really felt that this was her fate. Well, it's too late now. I've got the children. I love the children. He loves the children. They love him. And that at the back of her mind is that fairy tale fantasy of, if I try a bit harder, I can make this a perfect, happy family. So in effect, even though he's not blaming her, well, he is blaming her, she's blaming herself. So she's blaming herself when things go wrong. Maybe if I tried harder, maybe if I loved him more, if I showed him I loved him more, maybe if he felt more loved, he wouldn't behave like this. But of course, it's got nothing to do with that. But she said, I felt like this is it for me. What am I going to do? I'm not going to leave him. He'd never let me. And that sort of threat of, I won't let you take the children, it became his sort of tool. The kids already became a tool by which to control Karen. And he used them to control her.
The authorities are involved at some points along this tale. And in 2005, he's actually before the court for assaulting Karen, and AVOs have started to come into play here too. What is the outcome of that court date? Does anything happen to Gary? Is he punished for assaulting Karen?
Well, he should have been, and he would have been. So he was looking at a jail term and he knew it. And this was in 2005 at Norris Magistrates Court. So he was charged with assaulting Karen. He was always assaulting Karen. She'd got more chipped teeth and black eyes and bruises. And everyone knew. The locals knew. She thought she was keeping it quiet, but her family knew, everyone knew. So he goes to court and he's going to go to jail. So he convinces Karen to go to court with him. She wants her family. The kids love him. He convinces her of this. So she goes to court with him. And only that she did that, the magistrate said when he sentenced Gary to a suspended prison sentence of 18 months. But he actually said, had it not been for the fact that he was now reconciled with his victim, he would most certainly have gone to jail. And Bell knew that. He told Karen later on, well, the only reason I'm with you is because I wanted to avoid a jail sentence. He was quite open about that. That's the only reason I've got back with you, because I don't want to go to jail. He'd been to jail as a teenager and he didn't like it. And he didn't want to go there again.
So, Megan, on the night of Saturday, June 21st, 2008, there's an altercation at the house where Karen does eventually call Triple O. But what happens when police do finally come out? Because as you've mentioned, the isolation of that property actually worked against her in this instance because police get lost.
And in that terrain, it's very mountainous, bushy terrain with dirt roads. They lived up a dirt road. It would be very easy to get lost in the dark of night, wouldn't it? And most of these attacks took place at night. She had been on the telephone to her friend Tracy Wilson, who lived further along the Pericoe Valley, some distance away. While she was on the phone, Gary had come in drunk and stoned and had started a fight, an argument. And she was talking to her friend and he was abusing her and shouting and he attacked her and was pulling clumps of her hair out. And Karen had to hang up the phone because he was pulling her hair out and swearing and shouting at her. And the friend could hear all of this unfolding on the other end of the line. Karen then went outside for a smoke, thinking she could calm things down, just to let things settle. And when she came back in, she decided she would go to bed because he couldn't argue with her if she was sound asleep. So she went upstairs and got into bed. The baby was in the cot next to the bed. And he came into the bedroom, still enraged and drunk, pulled the covers off her and started kicking into her. He got her onto the floor and was kicking her so severely. It was probably the most brutal attack she'd had. And they were escalating, so she was scared and tried to ring Triple O because he was still carrying on. And that's when he'd ripped the phone out of the wall, but she'd made the call to the police. She'd already made that call. He then went off his head that the police were on their way and he was going to get sent to jail because there were AVOs out on him. You know, he's got a history. So she fled to her auntie's house. Her auntie and uncle lived not too far away, which in terms of the bush, it was quite a way. They were on the neighbouring property. And she managed to flee to that property and persuaded her auntie and uncle to allow her to use the landline to call the police again to see where they were. And the auntie and uncle were really nervous that Gary was going to come round. So they were watching the door, very nervous, and telling the police to hurry up and come. And they'd said that someone was on their way, but hadn't arrived. And at some stage, the police did come and they explained that they'd been driving around, they'd been lost. Basically, though, they put it on Karen. Instead of making a decision, and Karen is in no fit state to make that decision. So if she says, I want him locked up, he's going to be furious. And if he's bailed and comes home, she's in for trouble. If she doesn't say, I want him locked up, he's going to carry on where he left off. And the police said, well, what do you want us to do with him? They'd already seen him, so they'd gone around to the house and spoken to him. And Karen said she was cowering in her auntie and uncle's house and could hear him from where they were, screaming and ranting and raving and swearing on the doorstep of their farmhouse. So the police knew he was drunk, he was dangerous, he'd assaulted her before he got a history. And they'd come back and say to Karen, well, what would you like us to do? And she said, don't do that to me. I'm going to lose either way. In the end, she decided, lock him up. But she said, I shouldn't have had to make that decision. That's a decision the police ought to have made. So then the police went around to the house, and that's where Gary was raving on the doorstep. And then the police took him away. So at about 2:30 in the morning, they've charged him with assaulting Karen for the attack, dragging her out of bed and kicking her, and taken her an AVO. And so at 2:30 in the morning, he's released in Merimbula with no way of going anywhere. So he starts the long 65k walk back to the bush, to their farmhouse, which would have taken him hours and hours. And Karen did at least think that by the time he gets home, he will have sobered up. And he will also be in trouble, so he won't want that. But he didn't. He walked a little way, and then he rang her, again manipulating her. Oh, I've had an epileptic fit. I fell on the ground after having an epileptic fit, and the cops got stuck into me and kicked me in the head and attacked me while I was having a fit on the ground. And Karen said she didn't believe a word of it. He planted doubt, so he was manipulating her. I need you to come and get me and give me a lift, which is extraordinary, given that he's just been charged with assaulting her. She was scared if she went, and she was scared if she didn't. So she left it till about 8:39 in the morning when the kids had woken up, and the little girl was saying, I want my daddy. I miss my daddy. And the little boy was worried and saying nothing, but he'd already said to Karen, I'm glad they took him away. I don't want him to come back. So the little boy was sort of seeing Dad for the dangerous, unpredictable man he was. So Karen fed the children their breakfast, put them in the car and drove down to get him. That was on the Sunday, and he comes back and they're good to go again. So it all starts again. This time Karen says, I'm leaving you. I just can't do this anymore. I'm going to leave you. He said, well, you can go, but you're not taking the children. The children stay with me. They can't be without me. They need their father. You can't take them. She'd made her mind up that she was going to have to leave them because if she didn't, he was going to kill her. The police had said that to her and she was very scared. That was a really severe beating and she thought the next one could be my last. So she thought, well, he's never been aggressive to the children ever. He seems to adore the children. But if I stay, I'll be dead. So she left and she went down to a friend's house and stayed the night at the friend's. That was a Sunday night. So Gary was released from custody on the Sunday morning. And on the Sunday lunchtime, Karen left the house and went to her friend's. And she said, well, what about we share the care of the kids 50-50? And he wouldn't answer. And she said, well, I'll have to go. Now, bear in mind, she'd left him a lot of time. So she'd left in the past and left the kids with him. And she'd gone back to her parents in Bega, which meant hitchhiking lifts with truck drivers or ringing her brother from her neighbour's house. And her brother Tom would come and get her and take her back to her parents. But every time that happened, Gary would turn up in the car with the kids in the back. And she would see their little faces crying in the back. And he would say, they need their mother. We need to be a family again. So he was manipulating her into returning every time by using the kids as a means of doing it. So whether she really intended to leave, I don't know, but she said she did. She intended to leave him. She couldn't imagine staying. And that was on the Sunday lunchtime. She stayed the Sunday night on the mountain in the Pericoe Valley with a friend, who then drove her to the local store on Monday morning, and she hitched a lift with a truck driver to her parents in Bega. And she said, that's it. I've left him forever. But she didn't want to go without her children. She was really hoping he would relent and say, okay, they're too much like hard work. You take the children with you. But he wouldn't, because that's his trump card. That's the trump card that brings her back every other time. And I think she thought that was the same scene.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with journalist and author Megan Norris about the lost little lives of Jack, Maddie and Bon Bell, the victims of retaliatory filicide at the hands of their own father. So a few days passed with absolute silence from the farm, no word from Gary, and even the neighbours are starting to notice that they haven't seen Gary or the kids, who are usually out running around and jumping on the trampoline and yelling at each other. So Karen calls Tracy, the friend who's helped her escape in the past, and asks her to go and check on the kids. But Tracy's really scared of Gary too, so she doesn't want to go over to the property by herself.
Well, it's at night time too. So if he did kick off, it would take the police ages to find them. Tracy was worried too. Karen was worried because normally she would have heard from him. He would have been calling or he would have come down with the kids, and he'd done none of those things. And it was 2 days. So on the Tuesday, his mother was worried. So Gary's mother, Sheila Mills, who lived in Merimbula, it's a scattered community, but it's small and it's close-knit and everybody knows everybody, and they all knew Sheila. And Sheila had rung Karen's aunt and uncle who lived in the closest property next door to Karen and Gary. And Sheila had said, I'm really worried. I've been ringing the house and Gary's not picking up. I'm really concerned what's going on. So Auntie and Uncle, who knew that Karen had left and gone to her parents' home in Bega, they thought, well, maybe she took the kids with them then. Maybe she's taken the children with her to Bega. And they thought it was odd too. And they then said, well, we think that Karen was actually leaving him on her own. And Sheila panicked at the thought of her own drunken, drug-addicted son being at home with his 3 little children. She was really worried. So she rang Karen and she said, I'm really worried. Gary's not picking up the phone and I'm really worried about it. So Karen started to get worried. So Karen rang the police again and said, was there anything they could do to help? She was worried. No one had heard anything. And also her auntie had rang Karen in Bega and said, it's very quiet next door. Everyone was getting worried. So Karen rang her friend and her friend said, well, I could go around, but it's night and I don't really want to go around at night. So the friend rang the police and said, for goodness sake, you came out here a week ago. You arrested him. You've charged him. He's got an AVO and assault charges. Could you please send someone round? And they weren't keen to go because it was late at night. So they said, try and call us in the morning. And if you still heard nothing or you don't feel you can go around, we'll send someone out to do a welfare check. So the following morning, she decided she would go up there with her partner. And they strapped their own little child in the car and they drove up to the farm. And were immediately alerted to the fact that it was very quiet. Now, the auntie had rung Karen and said her fears were escalating because even the generator had gone off and she knew they needed the fire going, they needed the generator on. It was cold, it was winter. And it was a concern that it was not just silent, it was deathly silent. So she was truly worried. So the friends go up and they do a look around the house, no sign of the kids, no sign of Gary. And then the partner, Peter, wanders across the grass to look for Gary and he sees the four-wheel drive and he notices immediately there are 2 hose pipes taped to the exhaust and run from an exhaust into tubing, into the windows of the car. And then he has taped all around the cracks in the windows where the hose pipe has gone through. So there would be a gap that would let oxygen in. Every gap in that car was stuffed with clothing and the tubes were taped, stuck to the windows so they couldn't be pulled out. So he'd gone to a lot of trouble and killed them all. And so the poor neighbour just made this awful discovery and his wife was coming towards him, Tracy, saying, are they in the car? And he said, turn around, go back, don't come any closer, get back in the car. And he was really freaked out and they left the property, drove back to their own home where they immediately called the police.
So at this stage, Karen's standing by waiting to find out where her kids are and what's going on with Gary. Word is starting to spread because, as you mentioned, this is a very small community. Once ambulances and police cars start filing in, news starts to spread, and it seems journalists get a handle on this story before many of the family members too. And one of the family members gets a call from a journalist asking if they know anything about the man and 3 children who were found dead on the property in the Pericoe Valley. And then that relative then calls Karen's parents saying, what's going on? I've had a journalist on the phone. What's happened? Why didn't anyone call and tell Karen before all this news started to spread?
Well, that was Tracy's first instinct, Tracy Wilson, her friend. Her first instinct was to tell Karen. And she had promised that she would do that. She would go and check on Gary and the kids and call her up. So Karen was repeatedly ringing Tracy's phone and the police had said, do not answer it. Do not tell her. We have to go there first. We mustn't do that. So Tracy felt awful. Karen was ringing and ringing. She was having to let the phone ring out. So Karen was panicking. She wasn't getting a reply from the friend. She rang the police and said, I'm really worried. My friend was supposed to go around and see my children. And the police said, we can't tell you anything. We've had a lot of calls about this incident. So she knew something had happened, but she didn't know what had happened. And she said, but I'm the children's mother. And he still wasn't able to tell her anything. He said someone would call her back. Of course, by the time the police did get someone to call her back from the scene, it was already over the news. So her sister Sandra, who'd been driving somewhere in her car, had heard it on the radio news and had been so shocked that she'd pulled over because they all knew Gary was nasty. And she pulled over on the side of the road thinking, it's got to be them. She then rings her parents and says, what's going on? She rang her husband first, and then they rang her parents, by which time Karen had got on to Tracy. And Tracy said to the police, I can't do this anymore. I have to take that call. So she said to Karen, I did not have the words to share. I did not know how to tell her that her children were dead, but she did tell her the news. And Karen was absolutely distraught. She said there were primal howls down the phone, absolute anguished howls, and she could not believe it. So by the time the police did ring Karen, she knew, and she said, we already know. And they said, we're so sorry. So, that's how the news came out. But by then, they'd got a media chopper. The media had got a press helicopter over the bush. Newspaper journalists were converging on the bush. And suddenly everything was happening in Pericoe, this very quiet little sleepy town where nothing ever happened. And that's how the news got out. But it shattered the community.
In the aftermath of this, there is a lot of finger pointing. Because the truth of the matter was there were AVOs. Police knew what was going on. Child Protective Services had been involved at some stages, and they were being asked as to why they didn't do more to protect this family. Did any of that finger pointing actually go anywhere or help any ways to understanding how this was allowed to happen?
Not really. I think it was a lot of passing the buck going on. One of the things that came out of that was that someone from the women's refuge movement was quoted on the ABC saying that the law had just changed and no one seemed to be aware of it. The law had just changed. So if an intervention order, an AVO, was granted for a woman in a circumstance of violence where there were children in the relationship, then those children were automatically covered by the AVO. But nobody appeared to know that. So in Karen's case, it was, well, sorry, the kids aren't on the AVO. That's what one of the police officers told Karen when she rang to say, isn't there anything you can do? They said, are the kids named on the AVO? No. Well, there's nothing we can do. You left voluntarily. Hardly. Well, she didn't leave voluntarily. But as this woman pointed out, and those children should automatically have been included on the AVO anyway. So that was a huge failing on their part.
Karen, in the aftermath of this too, is trying her best to come to terms with what has just happened, having had her entire family wiped out in one hit. She is just lost and she's, falling into a very deep, dark hole. But through it all, she's seeing and hearing things being said about her and her family and her husband that are incorrect, that are misrepresenting her. And in fact, at one stage, somebody reports that the children were in the father's custody at the time. Like there was some kind of arrangement that he had the children, which then throws a shadow on her reputation as why she didn't have the custody of the children. None of that was even true. How does she respond to all of this?
Well, she was distraught. She was in no fit state to respond. She really wasn't. But her brother Tom was furious, and he actually responded to that. That was a New South Wales police statement that said there was no concern, the father had never been violent to the kids, and the children were in his custody. Well, that was the wrong word. The children weren't in his custody. She hadn't left voluntarily. She'd literally run for her life. And that's what they were missing. And that's what Karen's brother told media, that the police had got that wrong. One of the things that really upset me in that coverage was that one of Gary's former employers, one of Belle's former employers, said, oh, well, she was a spirited young woman who was always running away. She was running for her life. But he described her as feisty and spirited, but she was just taking off for the hell of it. She wasn't just taking off. She was running for her life. And he wouldn't let her take the kids. And that was what the brother told the media afterwards. The police had got it wrong. People were saying, oh, he was a likeable enough bloke. But there was also that dark side of Gary that came out there. The media coverage in the days that followed were very focused on who was the man that did this. And that's when it became apparent there were not only two identities with Gary Poxon, three if you count using his mother's maiden name. There were not just multiple identities. There were multiple personas. There was an affable bloke around town, the man around town who played footy and drank beer down the pub. And there was the monster behind closed doors that absolutely terrorised his wife and children. And the family was saying that. That's not correct. She would never have left her children. She had no choice but to leave because he was going to kill her.
Gary did leave behind suicide notes, which essentially blamed Karen for what he had done. But when Karen's allowed to go back to the property to collect personal items and items from her children, she's allowed to take the camera, which she's got years and years of photos on of her family that she wants to get developed. But when they do take it to get developed, they find that a lot of it has actually been deleted. And she's distraught about this. So they managed to get some tech whizzes to find what's happened to these photos and restore them, although not all of them. But at one stage, she's looking through it and she fleetingly captures something that hasn't been fully restored of Gary recording himself on this camera. What does she discover?
Well, he left 2 suicide notes, one for Karen, one for his mother. And of course, he blames Karen for everything because he did blame her for everything all the time. So it's a blaming suicide note. in effect, the sort of note that Kevin East wrote to Michelle Steck. It's very similar to that one. So he leaves his suicide notes, and he leaves a recording on a camera in which he says, this is it, it's over. He was going to go to jail. He couldn't bear to lose his kids, and they couldn't live without him, and he couldn't live without them. So he left that message. And then what happened is a friend took the camera to a local developer's because they wanted photos of the family for the funeral. They were putting together a montage for the funeral on the big screen. And so the friend offered to take the camera to a local developer, who said, to the friend's horror, that everything on it was destroyed. It wasn't going to work. He couldn't retrieve it. And she was so upset. And she said, this woman has just lost her whole family. If you could please try. So they did actually pull out all the stops, and they did manage to retrieve footage and photos for the funeral. When the friend took the camera back and Karen looked through that footage, amongst that footage was a recording that Gary had made on the Sunday after she had left. She knew it was the Sunday because in the background she could hear the radio playing, and it was a show they listened to every Sunday. And he was listening to this radio show, which timed the date. That it was days before they were discovered. No one was really sure. Later, when she was given photos by the police, she realised that the baby, Bon, was dressed in the same clothing that he'd been wearing when she left him at lunchtime, which put the time of death as the Sunday. So she was distraught. She said while she was taking refuge at her friend's not too far away, he was fixing hoses to the car, making these recordings and activating that murder-suicide plan. And she was devastated by that. And that's the thing these crimes generate, is the guilt. So whilst he blames her, as he always has, he wants her to blame herself, and she did. And all the mothers I spoke to said, I should have been there. If only I'd seen this coming, I would never have left. If only I'd have known. And that's exactly what those offenders mean to happen, and it did.
In 2009, there was an inquest into their deaths. What did that inquest uncover?
Well, it's a strange inquest because the findings under the coroner's rules did not name Gary as the killer of those children. The coroner was not allowed to under the rules of the Coroner's Act in New South Wales. But the cause of death was obvious. It was they'd asphyxiated on fumes from the exhaust and that it had been planned and carried out. But he said that it was not a crime that you could have predicted was going to happen. But certainly he commented on the failings in the system that had led to the death. Karen found that quite hard to fathom. Everyone knows it was a murder-suicide. They weren't looking at anyone else. And he said that there were no other parties involved. But he wasn't formally allowed to say that Gary had killed his children. But she showed great strength in that inquest, I thought, because she was more concerned about it never happening again to anyone else. What can we do to change this? How can we stop this sort of tragedy from ever happening again? He asked her, the coroner, what she wanted to say, and she told him that. I want to be assured this will never happen again, that things are put in place. And he promised he would convey her wishes to the New South Wales Attorney General, which he did. And interestingly, in the letter he sent to the Attorney General, the coroner mentioned that Gary Bell had killed his children. So he named him in that letter as the killer of the children, but wasn't allowed to under the Coroner's Act during the inquest proceedings. So it's sort of complicated, but he was acknowledging that Gary was the killer of the children, and the media certainly did. And she was so heartened by that and so encouraged that he'd actually heard her. And I think that's the thing about this book. Every single one of those women, 9 mothers whose stories I have covered, were not listened to. They were not heard. Their warnings about the children being in danger, their warnings that their former partners posed a threat, were either minimised or ignored or dismissed. Their voices were never heard. Their fears were never listened to. And to be heard is to be validated. So for Karen, having the coroner validate everything she'd said and honour his promise to her to pass that on to the Attorney General meant everything. And she said that when we were doing the book, she wanted to share her story. But she said, these cases still keep happening, don't they? And every time I see another case in the news, it rips my heart out. Michelle Steck said that. Dione Ferring said that. The Paulsons said that. Hannah Clark's parents say that all the time. The friends and family of Robert Edwards' family say that. Every time you see another case on the news, is it another family that might have been saved if people had listened? So this book really is giving them a voice together, a collective voice, so loud that you couldn't possibly ignore it. And that was the whole point of it. And that's why Karen wanted to be involved in it.
Well, you mentioned she's shown incredible strength through what many of us can't even imagine happening to us. And she does say that, yes, Gary won that time. And he definitely, at that time, thought he would have essentially killed her too by killing her children. But that she's gone on to have 2 children with, from all reports, a lovely, gentle man. And she says she can get her own way back at him by showing that she can live on and have a good life despite everything he's done to her.
I think that was quite significant in Karen's case and in quite a few of the others, that for a while there they do win. And when you've been a mum and you're defined by being a mother of 3 children, and suddenly you have no children. And one of the difficulties with these women, and they've all said the same, when they have new babies, they go to the hospital and they're asked, is this your first? And it's really hard to answer that question where you say, no, actually, in Karen Bell's case, it's my 4th. Then you've got to explain, and they don't want to have to keep explaining. It was a very challenging journey, but Karen was very focused on surviving, because then he didn't win. Just by being alive and rebuilding a new life for herself, he didn't win. He didn't win. And it was very, very important to her to do that. And she has done that. Mother of 2 more children, found a beautiful husband who really supported her through the inquest. And each one of those mums who have gone on, Jenny Ferring told me this, Michelle Steck told me, Cindy told me, Karen told me, you go on to have more children, and the births are joyful but overshadowed with loss and grief of memories of the deliveries you'd had, the children you've had before, what those births were like. It's very challenging, and the grief never goes away. It's always there.
Thanks to Megan for joining us across this special feature series about retaliatory filicide. Her book, Look What You Made Me Do, Fathers Who Kill, details the 4 cases we've covered over the past month, as well as 5 other equally harrowing cases of spousal revenge. Megan's book shines a light on the disturbing connection between family violence and retaliatory homicide, and why lawmakers and enforcers in Australia need to do more to support women and children in these situations. If you'd like to support Megan's work, you can find a link to her book in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan, with assistant production by Tahli Blackman. Our audio design is by Scott Stronach. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.